Hi everybody, thank you so much for joining us today. This is Sarah. I am the Marketing and Sales Director at Deep Vellum, and I, alongside Lindsay, who is our Development Director, have been coordinating virtual events to show you the breadth of Deep Vellum's authors and of literary creativity in Texas. So today I'm really excited because we have a launch event for our newest fiction book from Deep Vellum, and this is Jean-Luc Persecuted, which is a novel from C.F. Ramuz, the Swiss author. This is translated by Olivia Baes, who's here in conversation today with Emma Ramadan, who is also a translator. She's worked with Deep Vellum on a variety of books, and she is a bookstore owner in Providence, Rhode Island, and owns Riffraff Bookstore and Bar. So thank you so much for being here this evening to hear this conversation between two incredible translators. We are super excited to share Olivia's translation of this book. It's just incredible. If you're interested in purchasing this title afterwards, I recommend that you go onto Riffraff's site and order it from their online catalog. So I just want to quickly talk about two other upcoming events we have. Next week, we'll be launching our Authors in Their Homes series, which follows Deep Vellum authors from our catalog as they show us around their lives and their day-to-day in COVID. So we're starting with Noemi Jaffe next week. She is the Brazilian author of What Are the Blind Men Dreaming? We're also launching an Accessibility in the Arts series the following week on August 26th with an event called Dyslexia Strategies for Inclusion. And this is a panel featuring a variety of Texans who are working in the field. Both of these events are actually featuring giveaways as well. So if you sign up on our website under deepvellum.org/events, you will find registration links for both of these events. They are also featured on Zoom and on Facebook Live. Register on Zoom and you will have a chance to win a free copy of the books that are mentioned in those events. So that's pretty much all the information I have to share with you right now. I'm going to go straight into this event with Olivia and Emma. While this event is pre-recorded, I'm so excited to be able to share their thoughts because this is just two absolutely wonderful people who are in the Deep Vellum family who we are really excited to feature. Thank you so much for joining us this evening, and I hope y'all enjoy the event.
My name's Emma Ramadan, and I'm talking to translator Olivia Baes to celebrate the launch of Jean-Luc Persecuted by C.F. Ramuz, Charles Ferdinand Ramuz, which is being published next month, August 11th, Tuesday, August, somewhere in there, by Deep Vellum. And so I'm really excited to talk about this book. Olivia and I know each other from grad school, and Olivia is a Franco-American multidisciplinary artist who grew up in France, Catalonia, and the United States. Currently based in Catalonia, correct? Holds a bachelor's degree in comparative literature and a master of the arts in cultural translation from the American University of Paris. She has written multiple feature-length screenplays, including Le Mot Piano and Riche, which was selected as a project in development for the 70th Cannes Film Festival. What, you want me to say Riches?
It's in English.
Okay, Riches. Her translations include a co-translation of Me and Other Writing by Marguerite Duras, which came out from Dorothy, a publishing project in 2019. And I'm really excited to talk to you about Jean-Luc Persecuted because when we were doing our master's together at the American University of Paris, I knew you were working on this book. I knew it was really special to you, but I hadn't actually read it. And so I got my copy in the mail, a week ago and blew through it in 2 sittings and really enjoyed it. And to give a little summary of the book, Jean-Luc Persecuted follows the ill-fated life of an unhappily married man in a small mountainous village where everybody knows everybody. Jean-Luc and his wife Christine live with their newborn son and neighbors in pastoral peace. However, Jean-Luc's life reels into manic, unstoppable chaos when he arrives home one evening and his wife is nowhere to be found. And sort of from there, the book follows his kind of rapid descent into total madness and mental collapse. And we get also a lot of imagery of where he lives in these mountains, in presumably in Switzerland, and it's just a very rich book that not only on the sentence level and the word level, but also, you know, the descriptions and the like absolute mental collapse that we bear witness to as readers, and I really loved it, and I thought your translation was so great. Before we dive into your translation, just a brief introduction to Ramuz. Ramuz was born September 24th, 1878 in Cully, Switzerland. He was a Swiss novelist whose realistic, poetic, and somewhat allegorical stories of man against nature made him one of the most iconic French-Swiss writers of the 20th century. As a young man, he moved to Paris to pursue a life of writing, but then he returned to Switzerland in 1914, where he spent the rest of his life living and writing in the canton of Vaud, where he was born. And Ramuz pioneered a common Swiss literary identity, writing books about mountaineers, farmers, or villagers engaging in often tragic struggles against catastrophe. His legacy is remembered through the Ramuz Foundation, which grants the Quintennial Literary Award, the Grand Prix CF Ramuz, for Swiss writers in the French language, and his portrait is featured on the 200 Swiss franc note. So this guy's a big deal.
He's a rock star in Switzerland.
Clearly. So why don't you tell me or tell everyone a little bit about your relationship to Ramuz, how you came across his work, how you came across this book, and why you wanted to translate it.
So I was studying with you in Paris at this amazing master's in cultural translation. Unfortunately, it doesn't exist anymore, but it was we had great professors. One of them was Daniel Medin, who at some point for his class, we decided to co-translate something together, as you remember. And he sort of suggested Ramuz to us, and he offered us kind of two texts. One of them was Raison d'être, which was Ramuz Manifesto, on why he wrote the way that he did, which was from 1914. And then the other was Jean-Luc Persecuted, which was 1908. I think just for time reasons, because we were so swamped, we decided to do the shorter text, which ended up being my introduction to Ramuz, actually. And it was a great introduction at the end of the day, because as you remember, we dove straight into like a quite difficult text, which went into really great detail about, you know, his relationship to Switzerland, why he used the French language the way that he did, the opposition that had kind of like that he had come up against throughout his life, even talking about being a school child and being in these classes where the French language was taught in a way that felt totally unnatural to the school children who were growing up, you know, in the nature in Switzerland, in a totally different environment than Paris, where kind of like the people were keeping the French language in this sort of strict way. I mean, in Switzerland, it was used in a completely different way. And he noticed that from a very young age. And as he kind of got older, decided that he was gonna kind of stray from using the language of l'Académie Française, basically of the French Academy. And so we were introduced to this text, and then later, when I had to do my thesis, I dropped actually a Spanish book that I was going to work on for Jean-Luc Persecuted, because I was super intrigued by the plotline, which sounded like very dramatic, and I absolutely wanted to know like what happened. And so I remember being on the Eurostar and reading it like in one sitting, just totally absorbed by the book. And I mean, that's how I discovered him, was through Daniel Medin. And it just fit right away. Like I have a tendency towards like very dark literature and sort of these, quite suspenseful, quite dramatic stories. And I think that there was something about the passion which was transmitted through this small book that kind of really like shook me on the sort of narrative level. But then also I could just tell that this guy's rhythm was absolutely authentic. There was something, there was something completely groundbreaking and sort of genuine in the way that he told this story. And when I found out about him, and I found out about and I kind of put everything together. I thought, okay, like this rhythm it's going to be a challenge to translate it, but I want to try this, and I'm super inspired by this project. Sorry, that was a long answer.
No, it's funny too, because it really is the kind of book that you could read, and it's almost ideal to read it in one quick burst.
Absolutely.
Yeah, because the rhythm does it builds and builds, and there's this momentum to it, and it also, correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm realizing now these kind of maybe connections between you and Ramuz, like you grew up all over the place. Your English maybe is always like, there's like a different texture to your English that you and I have joked about before. And because your English was inflected by all these different places where you lived, and also by learning English in school settings mostly.
Right, exactly. I mean, that was actually, that's as I kind of dove into his work, because before translating him, I read a couple other novels by him. And I was super touched by the way that he decided to write in this French that wasn't quote unquote correct, and wasn't the French of l'Académie Française, wasn't the French that everybody was accepting at the time in terms of, literature. And because I grew up speaking French, and then I went to the States, and I had to learn English in school, in an American school when I was 8, and it was really rough. Like when you're kind of imposed a language, and you're made fun of if you don't say things the right way. You really feel your difference. You really feel like you're sticking out, and you can either kind of, I mean, for me, it was something that I struggled with, but eventually I actually I began writing in English from a really young age. And I think that my need to write in English was like a way to kind of like master this language, and not let it master me, and let my difference ring within this language, and essentially you do that through rhythm. And I think like when I was kind of, when I sort of was introduced to Ramuz, I don't know, I kind of felt this kinship with him, even though it's a totally different situation. But I kind of felt this kinship with him for that reason, that he was writing in a French that not everyone thought was good. They some academics, some writers considered it to be bad. And he was doing it because he basically wanted to write in a way that was genuine to himself as a subject, and to the people of his land. Like he wanted to represent the way that his language was spoken, where he came from, and not let it master him, And so, yeah, I definitely felt this kinship with him. And I think that when I translated, I decided right away that that was going to be my starting point, is to sort of remember what his manifesto, what his raison d'être was when he wrote. It was to represent the people from the land that he came from, and to let that difference ring, and to make sure that even if it wasn't, quote unquote correct, it was genuine. And I think that that's super, I think that that's one of the most important manifestos you can kind of have as a writer, especially when you're dealing with like either a minor language, or like a language like Swiss French, which is French, but is completely different.
Yeah, and to going off of what you're saying, you have this really beautiful quote in your translator's note of something he said. I have always tried to be truthful and wrote badly, precisely only out of a need to be more truthful, or if you will, more authentic, to be as true as authentic as possible, which is just such a beautiful, powerful thing to say, and like such a succinct explanation of why when you read his French, it doesn't read like any other French. It doesn't read, yeah, and so in turn, like your translation, and I think what's so excellent about your translation and what makes the book, I mean, the book is interesting plot-wise, but what makes the language continue in English to be so interesting and so wonderful and so truthful is that you wanted to make sure it didn't just read normally, like neatly, you know, properly, whatever that might mean, that, you know, when you read this book, you feel the way he's using language, you feel the way his syntax and his grammar and his rhythm are sort of not like at odds, but are sort of informing the way he's writing, are kind of making themselves known in this text. And you've done such a wonderful job of making that known in your English text. Like when you read this book, it doesn't, you know, it doesn't read like every other English. It doesn't read like some normal, boring, you know, language. It's very clear that you've done something here. So can you talk a little bit about how you went about that, your process? I know as part of it, this was your master's thesis, and you had some like creative work around it as well, and kind of like tuning into it. So I'd love to just hear more about that.
Thanks. Actually, you said something. You said, I love what you've done. And like one of the thinkers that really inspired me with my process was French linguist Henri Michonic, who's this kind of amazing, just an amazing linguist that we discovered in our master's together, actually through Rhyme and Life, one of his essays, through our professor Jeff Gilbert. And he has a manifesto of his own called the Rhythm Manifesto, in which he says that to use language as a subject, that is to have language really be the language of the subject and pass through the body, and not have it be some kind of imposed language that you're getting from, you know, the sort of, for example, l'Académie Française, or the norms of whatever you're in. You have to write it from the place that you're in. You have to write it. You have to use the rhythm that you have, whether you're a peasant in the middle of a field in the Canton of Vaud, or you're, you know, I don't know, a businessman that's like traveling from one place to another and whose accent is getting a little bit inflected because of the traveling. So there was this amazing quote where he says, the translator, for him, it's not about either foreignizing or domesticating a text. It's actually that translation is a totally other thing called traduire écrire, which is translation writing, I guess, translating writing. He uses a dash, and he says, you know, in order to do this traduire écrire, this translation writing, the text has to do what it does in the original. And so there's something about like, there's something about that sounds a bit like mystical, like how do you make the text do like what it does in the original, that we dealt with when we translated Duras together. We know it's quite difficult, but I think the guide was rhythm, because Ramuz has such a particular rhythm. As you said, like his syntax, his grammar, his repetitions, his use of verb tenses, there's a lot of fragments. I mean, it's very irregular. Like across the board, it is irregular as you're reading it, and you are confronted with this difference, you know, that you're probably not used to if you're not from this place. And so this rhythm was what I absolutely sought to preserve in the English, even if it quote unquote deformed the English and made it into something that felt a little uncomfortable. I think that from the beginning, I wasn't worried about the text feeling on reading as a little uncomfortable or reading as a little different, because I knew that, as you said, the French is like that. When you come across it, you understand that what he's doing is something that's quite different. And in a way, he's doing it because he's trying to be true, like the quote that you read, he's being true to his land. So my process was very much keeping with the rhythm. That meant that I was reading aloud, you know, basically like all of the passages before translating. I, as much as possible, was trying to preserve the grammar, because I think that his grammar is so odd in French already. You know, he pairs like semicolons with a dash right after. He will sort of like have all these commas, and then all of a sudden you arrive at a fragment that you feel like should be a different sentence, but it's still within that really, really long sentence. And there's just I never felt like he had rules going. I felt like what was happening was more, like you said, this movement, this momentum, which she wrote about a lot, this élan that in French she called it, this momentum that kind of moves us through this story, which is like a very dramatic story because it's somebody tumbling towards madness. So you have this momentum that's not only the momentum of the narrative, but that's also this momentum of like how Jean-Luc, this character, and how Ramuz at the same time are moving through the land with this language, and how they're kind of like navigating these landscapes, how they're dealing with the emotions that are coming up as the text is developing, which obviously there's some sort of crescendo, you know. And I think that as long as I sort of kept with that rhythm, I, you know, it's like, it was off the feeling too. Like I would reread my passages, I would read the passage in French, then reread my passage and think, okay, is it doing what the text does in the original? Which is a little abstract, but it's like, you feel it through the rhythm. And then I tried, for example, this is something that Meshonic talks about in his books on translation, is he says often translators, because it's super difficult to keep the same amount of syllables for one word in another word. But syllables in the end are integral to rhythm, and they really end up syncopating the text and really making you feel it the way that you feel it in the original. So I was trying to keep, where I could, because obviously it's not available, you can't do it everywhere, but I was trying to keep the same amount of syllables for some words, you know, that I felt were kind of like integral to the way the rhythm went along. And also he talked a lot about how in many texts, it's very common to, even if you don't really have to, you end up switching the order of words in the language that you're translating in, just so that it's more fluent and more readable. But often what that does is that takes away from the original sort of way that you're seeing what's going on in the book. And I think that sort of brings me to Ramuz, like for me, he's a very, and I know there's been a lot written on this, like he's a cinematic writer, like the way that when you read his book, you really see it and you really move through it as if you're kind of moving along with the character, sort of. He doesn't necessarily give you a lot of clues about the interior, what's going on inside the character. You sort of gather it from all of the context and sort of that the way this context is affecting this character. And I think that the order of words for that is seeing in that order, you know. It's sort of like if you keep certain orders, you see it in the same order that you do in the original. You kind of arrive at the emotion at the same moment, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and it's funny that you bring up the cinematic, because in that way there are so many parallels between Ramuz and Duras, and
yeah,
like,
exactly, that's true, absolutely.
but I actually noted in your translator's note, because when you and I translated Marguerite Duras, it was like all about rhythm. We were reading things out loud to each other. We were like arguing back and forth about rhythm for, you know, decades. It felt like in the best possible way. But yeah. We always talk about Marguerite Duras being like the sea, being like the ocean, this like thing that you're like in her wake. Whereas with Ramuz, you talked about how he feels like the wind.
Yeah, absolutely. Like I think that I mean, to be honest, I don't think that the process was that different between what we did with Duras and what I did with Ramuz. I think that these authors can be kind of held up next to each other in sort of the way that they use language. Like Duras, at the end of the day, learned French in Vietnam, so she learned it with the kind of syncopation of Vietnamese. I've always thought that might affect, you know, her tone and the way her rhythm. And you and I were following her rhythm, you know, we were like following the waves of her rhythm, sometimes drowning in it. But like in terms of Ramuz, I think that I definitely feel like the wind is applicable to him, or like it's a great metaphor, because he really kind of like moves you through a story in a way that for me is sort of like you're being pushed, you know, like you kind of have no choice and you're sort of just like being pushed into this story, and you don't feel like you really are controlling the situation as a reader, you know. Whereas if you want to use the C with Duras, I sort of feel like, especially with her repetitions and the way that she says things like 5 different times, like in a different way in paragraphs, you're it's like the ocean, like you're going with these waves. I think with Ramuz, it's sort of like this momentum that, yeah, it's quite cinematic in the way that it's in the present you're living the present moment with the character. There's not much reminiscing. There's not much going back in the past or thinking about the future. If you read Jean-Luc, it's sort of like you said, in fact, I think it's like this burst of reading, because you are just kind of following this character until his very end. And as the book is going on and on and on, because of the great way that Ramuz builds the suspense, you sort of feel like there's just no stopping it, you know. And sort of how the wind, I think for me, I always thought is like the most uncontrollable of the elements, you know. It's sort of like, I mean, I live in Catalonia, where there's this wind called the tramuntana, and it's like one of the craziest winds. It gets up to, you know, like 200 miles an hour. And when it's here, you can't escape it. You can't see it, you can't escape it, but it's there and you feel it, you know. And I sort of feel like Ramuz writes with that same strength and that same kind of forward momentum.
Yeah, and especially like for a book as dark as this book, like without giving too much away, it doesn't get much darker than this. But like for it to be so dark and yet for it to be such a quick reading experience is, you'd think things would be at odds, but it really is this, like, you're swept through it.
Yeah, and I think that because there's this crescendo where it just is like getting worse and worse, like for me it's a bit, the story is almost like this, I think one reviewer actually said it in the Kirkus reviews, it's almost like a gothic tale, you know. You kind of feel like there's no hope. Like you get to the point, at some point in the narrative, you understand this guy is not really making it out of here, you know, like, and there's no sequel to Jean-Luc. So it's like you get this feeling that you're with him till the end, and sort of, yeah, like I think that the writing mimics that tragedy, that tragic kind of fate that he has, you know.
So you're saying there's no Jean-Luc Resurrected?
Yeah, exactly. Jean-Luc 2, Resurrected.
Resurrected dash. Will you read a little bit from the book?
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, like the part that I want to read is the part that I used for my thesis, because I think it's a great example of everything we've just been talking about. It's actually in the very first chapter. Jean-Luc comes home. He's going to work with Christine, his wife's dad, who ends up being sick, and so he ends up having to come back home unexpected. And he comes home and the baby is sleeping in one of the rooms, and she's not there. She left her baby at home. And so he thinks, okay, maybe she went to see the neighbor, and he starts getting just this stomach ache and this horrible kind of like gut feeling that I think as a reader you kind of get right along with him. Like and actually this passage is super cinematic, because it's like the atmosphere is like you're feeling everything that he's feeling, and you have this gut feeling that's kind of growing and growing, that something terrible is happening. And so he ends up seeing footsteps in the snow, because his neighbor says, no, like she's not here, I don't know where she is. Wives should never be left alone, wink, wink. And so he sees these footsteps, and he goes in the snow, and he says, okay, I'm gonna follow the footsteps. And so he follows these footsteps, and after about, I don't know, like 1 kilometer or 500 meters, he thinks, yeah, it's her shoes. I bought her those shoes. Like, and he recognizes the pattern of the shoe. And he understands that she probably has gone to see a lover that she had before they were together. So I'll read sort of, yeah, I'll start from there. Quite embarrassed, I'm reading from my mobile, but bear with me. Right, so he had set off again. He began to walk faster. He quickly arrived at the crest. There, you enter a combe. The trail goes off down the middle. Larches the color of honey, their trunks gray in certain branches already skinned, look to be arranged all around. Up ahead, from a gash in the green sky, a faraway summit appeared, pink. There was a little pink too, almost blonde rather, in the light, on the snow, while various dips and ridges, in this velvet, sparkled like gold, like so on a bush, the tip of a tree, a rift in the terrain. But the heart is sad, and all was in silence. A tow in flight passed now and again in the sky, where it occupied a space, then no longer occupied it. Sounds came from very far off, like strangers to the land. You heard the village bell ring. You didn't know from where. Maybe in the prairie. Soon it hushed. A gunshot blasted a poacher's in a gorge all the way over there, which dragged out for a long time, jarred into echoes. And Jean-Luc brushed his hand against his forehead, for he was sweating, but he didn't halt. Now he would have had his eyes closed, guessing it all. He went up the combe, took another right, then, among the first larches, headed toward the forest. He entered the forest. Suddenly, there was another place that had been trampled upon, following which he could only distinguish a single trace, that of the man's big footprints. He examined it. No, only one. His legs failed him. He thought, he had to have carried her. She was tired, he carried her. And indeed, the traces were deeper than before, more dragged, with here and there a stone popping up, and under the trees a little black earth or the needles of larches. Elsewhere, someone had banged into a hidden root, then had rested, and that is when the two small feet appeared once more. It was as he had predicted. At the edge of the forest, there was a new hayloft belonging to a man named Augustin Crétaz. It's him, thought Jean-Luc, but they told me he was away, so it must be that he's back, and she didn't tell me. He was leaning against a tree. He watched. You couldn't hear anything. You couldn't see anything. There must have been hay. It's comfortable to lie in hay. He moved as if to go forward, but at that moment, someone over there began to laugh. He knew this laugh well. He hurried back down. Oof.
It's such an amazing passage because he's putting together the pieces of this story of his wife cheating on him, all from these footprints in the snow, and like where there's one woman's footprints and then there's clearly a man's footprints and then there's one set and then there's two, and he's right, like all of it, it's not all in his head, like these
Yeah.
he understands this land and this setting and this scenery so well that he can tell the story and be right just looking at these footprints.
Right. And there's sorry. No, I'll let you finish.
I was going to ask you a translation question, so I'll let you talk more about.
No, I was going to say, and there's something, for me, it's so beautiful because as you read it, not only are you seeing it because it's quite visual. I mean, he's really describing the setting, the colors, the texture, like the sounds. Like it's not only visual. I mean, he is talking about the sounds too, and he's using this pronoun that appears so many times in the text, which is the famous which translators always are like, what do I do? But here I opted for you because I think there's so much of this momentum where you are with him and you are kind of feeling everything as if you are walking there, you know, that it is you, like it is you who is feeling all those things. And when you arrive at the end, what that does also is kind of that, it's like you heard it and you're you know, about to vomit or whatever. Like there's really this anxiety just kind of mounts in you. And I think, yeah, it's super cinematic also. Like there, you can imagine that this would be a great scene to kind of like build suspense, and there not much is revealed, like you said, except for the footsteps and the sound of her laughter at the end that gives everything away, and that confirms this suspicion. You do feel like he's dreaming it all up, and then it's like, no, this is the reality, you know. Anyway.
That's actually exactly what I was going to ask you, was the choice to use you for because
We're so topic.
As a fellow translator of French and as someone who's translated with you, I mean, it is like an absolute, it's like the bane of a translator's existence.
Yeah. And I mean, we came upon it together in Duras so many times too.
I think in Duras,
and it's hard to know sometimes.
Yeah, it can mean one, it can mean we, it can mean you, it can like, I think the normal or the one like typical strategy translators use is to make it is to change the structure of the sentence. So instead of like you or one or you hears, where do you have it?
It's, I think, towards the end.
So blah blah blah.
I think it's towards the end. It says, you couldn't hear anything, you couldn't see anything, there must have been hay.
Oh, I'm thinking of,
Oh, you were thinking of above.
I'm thinking of here, you heard the village bell ring, you didn't know from
Oh,
when.
exactly.
Um, yeah, which like I think
It's very sensory, like.
yeah, and I think like so one strategy that like another translator might have used would be to do the village bell rang from an unknown place, right?
Right, right.
Which is so
But
much
then, right. But
it's
then I feel like that's fixing it completely into like the village bell ring, when right after it's like, it's clear that because his heart is kind of like, you know, sort of has stopped beating and he's feeling so sick to his stomach, he doesn't know if he's really hearing that. He doesn't know where it's hearing from anymore. Like there is a sort of disorientation. It's weird because there's this contradiction going on where, like you said, it's like he's absolutely situated in this place that he knows very well, but then at the same time, the emotion is making him super disoriented, you know, disorientated. That's one of those words I say wrong in English, I think.
hard. Yeah. But the beauty of your English is that it doesn't have to be proper.
Yeah, exactly. No shame here.
Safe space for weird English. Not that yours is weird. It's funny because like actually your English, like one particular thing you do has rubbed off on me ever since I've known you, which is
Really?
that. Like instead of saying that way, so like you could say, oh, can you open the window like that? It'll be cooler in here, as opposed to open the window.
It's very French, this thing, I think. It's very French. Oh, did it rub off on you?
Yeah, I do that all the time now.
There you go. See, the my language passed through my body, then passed through your body. It'll rub off on more people in time.
I'm sure it has already. But it's funny because you said something earlier about this idea of rhythm and whatever being abstract, and I actually don't think it's very abstract for you as a translator at all, because like yeah, you can like talk about it theoretically, but it's also very bodily. Like translating this book, translating Juhas, like I've witnessed your translation process be extremely bodily. Like as in like you have to it has to feel right when you read it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think that's what I always said about it being something. I like the verb. I like Jean-Luc's verb does, like it has to do what it does in the original, because I think that the verb to do is like this kind of material, like this, I don't know, like there's something about it that feels a bit bodily, like it's sort of, what does it do to your body, you know, for example, like how does it feel? And sometimes it's like there's no way of really knowing, it just is how it sits within you. It's almost the same as that gut feeling that he gets when he sees the one footprint, you know, it's like it just kind of flashes upon you. You don't really know, but you're like, yeah, that's it. And I know that you have those moments all the time too. And I think when you sort of prioritize rhythm, that is kind of what ends up happening, because you're no longer picking apart whether the meaning is exactly right. You're just actually feeling the text move through you and thinking, is it moving through me the same way that it's moving through me in the original? Like there is this sort of inexplicable thing. It's sort of hard to talk about for that reason. Like it's hard to pin down exactly what we're doing. But I get what, yeah, absolutely. I think that it's a lot about the body for sure.
And you have this part of your translator's note, which by the way, this is like the best translator's note I've ever read. So if people are reading this book, like don't skip the translator's note.
Thanks so much.
This line, which I think is a quote from Ramuz, from his journals. My style must have the gait of my characters. And this idea that démarche, the French word for gait, can also mean approach and can also mean process. And it's like this idea that his like rhythm and his approach, it's like literally how he walks, how he moves, how he like goes through the world. It's his gait and then it's also his approach.
I mean, there's like absolutely no distinction. You find out from everything he's written that is nonfiction, which includes raison d'être, of course, as his kind of primary manifesto. But he, for example, has this journal. You can't really see it, but it's one of the first things I bought when I knew that it was going to be my thesis. I bought the journal from 1904 to 1920, Journal Notes et Brouillons, like sort of like just random little notes. Some of them are more you know, structured than others and stuff, but some of them are just one-liners. And you find out that not only on like an emotional level, like I think he's someone that really felt what he had a lot of empathy for his characters. Like he really went through the same sort of traumas and kind of like the same violence that his characters go through as he was writing. You really feel like this guy felt it all very deeply, you know. But there's also this obsession with this being his life's mission, and he's gonna write this way, and there's no way that he's ever gonna write the way people want him to, and he's gonna be poor, he doesn't care, but he's gonna write. Actually, there's this amazing quote that I wanted to read where he says something, maybe I can find it, but maybe I can just summarize it. I think he says like, let me be poor, but that the language that the language that I'm living come out of my body still living. Like he had this thing about wanting the language that ended up on his page to be living. Like there was really something of wanting to keep the text alive. And I take that as meaning, I think that rhythm, and he talked a lot about rhythm himself. I think that rhythm is a big part of language being alive. You know, I think that when we think of the people we love, their voices, what we remember most is their rhythm, you know, is like how they actually speak, the way that they syncopate their words. I think that that's a big part of, that's almost, that makes a person, you know. And I think he wanted that rhythm to be preserved. Absolutely.
I'm wondering, like, you know, on the back of this book, there are blurbs from Stefan Zweig and Juan Rulfo, like the like, you know, these like great, yeah, and like he has his own prize, and like he like Ramuz a big deal, but like we don't really know about him at all in English, and even French people maybe like don't know that much about him, and he's sort of this like literary figurehead in Switzerland, but like hasn't really like crossed the bounds into other territories. And I'm wondering, do you think that's because of this sort of like judgment placed on the way he used language, and that his language wasn't seen as correct, and that they saw it as writing badly on like, do you think that's part of it? Do you think that's part of why maybe translators haven't tried to translate him? Like there's this fear that in English it'll read as like a bad translation. How do you deal with all of that?
I think it was one of the things I investigated on when I did my thesis, and I found out that, for example, D'Arborance, which I think now has been translated as When the Mountain Fell, I'm pretty sure. Don't quote me on that. But anyway, it was I think it was the first book, maybe. 1947. It was translated by by an American translator for the American market. So pretty early on, I mean, pretty like sort of, I mean, towards maybe like more the end of his career, but like pretty early on. And she made the English really fluid, and she erased that difference we've been talking about. And I mean, actually, she was a woman. I can't, maybe she had a lot of pressure. We don't even know if it was her. It might have been the editors, you know. But in any case, I haven't found a translator's note. I haven't found any documents around the book. But what I did find were a lot of articles, some of them in the Swiss newspapers of that time, saying that people hadn't liked the book. And the reason they hadn't liked the book is because all of its sort of roughness and this kind of raw quality that it has had been erased and had been sort of made into this very palatable English, basically. And so what happened is that he became this sort of, he was seen and he was read as this regionalist author without that texture, you know, where really it could have been a book written about a little a little village in a mountain, or a little village in a country place like Montana or whatever, you know, like an American story. He sort of lost what made him special through that translation. And so I think that the interest wasn't piqued. Like people weren't that excited about reading more of him because they kind of categorized him as this sort of, regionalist, like pastoral, I guess, like writer. And I think that, as we've said, like what makes for example, a book like Jean-Luc Persecuted and Jean-Luc Persecuted, which is quite similar, like so special, is that difference, and is the fact that it's in a very, very specific place, and that it's happening in a very specific landscape, and that the people there have very specific like behaviors, you know, and that they're behaving in a way that we are not, maybe not all of us, but that a lot of us are not used to and haven't encountered before. And I think that that's what draws us in, like, and he captures that in such a way that then Jean-Luc's kind of madness and grief and all of, you know, that combustion of all those emotions becomes universal, because you just access it in a place that is genuine, like in a place that you can feel has really been felt by the writer. And you know what I mean? So
Yeah.
I think that had a lot to do with the American, with sort of the English speaking world, maybe, is one of my theories. And then I think in France, he has had like his place in literature. He's definitely not, you know, he's not one of the greats in France, because there are just already, there are so many greats that it's like he doesn't make it on the list, because he does stay in that region. His stories are in that little spot. And I think it's Rulfo that says this amazing thing about him, is like, that could have been a total flop, that he stayed in that like really small region. Like it could have been something that made him uninteresting, because he's like recycling the same things over and over. But in fact, it's like he's becoming like this master of like the emotions in that place and capturing them in that really specific place, you know. I don't know, I really believe that that's true. I think that he found a way to communicate those very deep emotions, and those kind of to kind of communicate like the unknown about life in a place that he was so familiar with. You know, it makes sense to me anyway.
Yeah, and like, how many authors has this happened to, where like a translator or an editor is afraid of like getting bad reviews because the language sounds weird, or sounds wrong, or it sounds like a bad translation, or it sounds like too foreign, or whatever the excuse to like flatten the prose, to kind of,
Right.
you know, like you use the word palatable, which I think is right. Like, you know, all the Clarice Lispector translations that had to be redone because that exact thing had happened. And
Yeah.
like, it's happened, we know it's like happened with Duras, you know, it's probably happened to so many of like the greatest authors that we read all the time. And
I think yeah.
for like,
Sorry.
you know, there's just like this pressure for it to sound like perfect English, but like, why should it sound like perfect English? Why is that like our golden rule for everything? And
Right, and I think it's probably like an economical thing. Like you know, you think you can sell more books if it's readable to a larger public, but actually, I mean, when you look at these authors and the way that they've been received in their original language, like the reason that they became the authors that they are is because of their strangeness and their alterity. You know, like, I mean, that is what you should preserve in order to get them sort of maybe to the same level, I guess, somewhere else. I think anyway.
yeah.
I think that that's so important.
And even like, I would say any other translator would maybe have changed the title of this book.
Oh,
Like, Jean-Luc Persecuted. It's such a strange title, but it's like, it has the same rhythm as the French. It's like, you know, it has the same meaning, but I feel like other translators or maybe other publishers would have like balked at keeping it so weird.
I mean, I was originally supposed to publish this book with a different publisher, and we then decided not to do it together, a little bit for the reasons that we're talking about now. And basically the title had changed to Jean-Luc's Persecution, which for me, I was never on board with. Like I there is something about Jean-Luc Persecuted that is strange, but that for me echoes the French so well, and echoes this kind of like, I mean, like, I don't know, this is kind of, it's like a finality, you know, it's like he's been condemned, like Jean-Luc Persecuted, like, you know, instead of Jean-Luc's Persecution is like, I don't know, like, it just doesn't give me that same punch, you know. There's something about Jean-Luc Persecuted that's almost like, oh my God, it almost looks like his last name, you know what I mean? Like, it's like attached to him, like, it's not like his persecution, it's like, it is him.
And I mean, that, like, not, we don't have to get too much into this, but it's incredibly kind of scary for, this was going to be your first published translation.
Right.
And you have to walk away from a translation contract as like a beginning translator because you were sort of being bulldozed into like smoothing over this language and making it more palatable, and for you to say like, no, I'm not going to like reduce this author's weird, jagged, textured prose to something like palatable for the sake of just having a published translation. I'm going to make sure this
Right.
book does what it's supposed to do, even if that means like risking it not being published. And I'm really
Absolutely.
happy for you that obviously you found a great home for it. And you know, it's it's like so thrilling for me to see it finally coming out in the world, and to know
It's finally being persecuted.
your persecution has been lifted. But like just coming out in the world, and also to know that it's coming out into the world the way you
Oh
intended.
yeah. I mean, I'm so thankful for a publisher like Deep Vellum, just because, I can't, like, the thing is that I understand like the economic factors of kind of the book industry, and of being scared to like have something come out that's nobody is going to want to touch because they think it's too weird or whatever. But at the end of the day, I don't stand by that. And if it's me translating and it's like, Ramuz and I have been, it really feels like this kind of, I've been trying to do what he did. And it's like this mystical sort of pairing. I'm gonna stand by him like till the end. Like it was really clear to me that I would never betray him. It felt like a betrayal, like if I did it any other way. It's super intense, I know, like, and part of my thesis was that I wrote letters to the guy even though he's dead. But like I absolutely had to, I had to hold on, and there was no option. Like I wasn't gonna let it come out in a way that I didn't think, where I didn't think the text did what it did in the original. And also, he's as I just told you, 1947, like, look what happened. Like, this has happened to him before. So it's like, I personally, if it's in my hands, I'm never going to let that happen to him again. And so I'm super thankful to Deep Vellum for believing in this book.
I mean, thank God for small publishers, and like there are some of the bigger ones too willing to take risks on these kinds of books, because I think it'll pay off. I mean, this is such a fantastic, but like easily the most exciting thing I've read this year, and like the most exciting translation I've like maybe ever read. So and not just saying that because you're like my dear friend, and you
can tell everyone.
I'll run this later. No, but like genuinely, I mean, it's so exciting for me, and just to even like have this conversation with you and hear you talk about it and hear your connection to the author is like genuinely inspiring to me. Like every time you and I have these conversations about books and stuff, I like even like have all these ideas in my head, and I'm like, oh my God. So this is great. So we've been talking for almost an hour, so maybe I'll wrap up just by asking you, if you have any advice for other translators who are like starting out and who are pursuing these kinds of stranger projects, and then also like what you're working on now, what you're reading now.
Yeah, I mean, it goes right in hand with what I just talked about. Obviously, if you really believe in your translation and you really believe in the book that you translated, and I would say, like, if you're starting out, you don't have to kind of give in to certain pressures around domesticating, flattening English or any other language. I think that why literature reaches us is because of like these strange rhythms, and because of like telling these, at the end of the day, what are universal stories in so many different ways, and through so many different subjects. And I think that as translators, I sort of see us as like the gatekeeper to that, in other languages. And so I think that's one thing. Like, if you can try to, stay true to what you had in mind, and then also, like that goes along with it. Like, don't give up. I think that it's that people should, I also think that you shouldn't be scared of contacting publishers that you really admire. Like I'm speaking for myself, like between Dorothy Project that we that we translated Duras with, and Deep Vellum, I respected these guys before, and I think like go for it, you know? Like I think don't be afraid like to knock on those doors. I think that even if you're starting out, like what really matters at the end of the day for me is, I think as a translator, what I think is the most sort of potent thing is passion, you know? Like if you have passion for a project, like you're probably going to be able to sell it and to sell it to a publisher, even if it is a publisher that you're sort of, you don't know, you know, I don't know. I think that perseverance, like, and passion are like a great combo. I don't know if that's very like practical. It sounds a bit like, but
in like a world and an industry like this where like, you know, we're not making millions of dollars. The publishers aren't, I mean, most of them aren't making millions of dollars.
yeah,
It's like if you don't have passion and you're not like being guided by passion, then like why are you doing it? Like there's just not
yeah,
really
exactly.
other things to get out of it, right? So I mean, it's
And I mean, yeah, for sure. I always think of the story that Daniel met in coming back. It's like a loop coming back to him because he's the one who introduced us to Ramuz. He always told us that story, and I had a Kafka class with him as a literature student, and he told us the story of how Kafka came to be translated in English for the first time by this couple, the Muirs. And I think that it was just passion. Like they were just very passionate readers of Kafka. Like he resounded in them, and they wanted to have that echo in English, you know, like it was like this passion project, and it was like also a love project because they were a couple, I guess. But there for me, that always stayed with me. It's like it should, like you say, ignite from that passion, you know.
well, on that note, maybe we'll wrap it up there on that like very hopeful, lovely note about translation and passion. Thank you so much. This was so lovely to talk to
It
you.
was great. Thank you so much to you.
Back in the classroom at AUP.
Yeah, except no teachers now.
We're the teachers. We're schooling everyone.
Yeah.
Okay, well,
Thanks so much, Emma.
yeah, the book comes out August 11th, we decided.
And this amazing cover by Chad Felix. I think, yeah, I'm like, I hope that's exactly his name, but super amazing.
Yeah, great cover, great book, great translation. Buy it from Deep Vellum, buy it from your local independent bookstore, etc. Yeah, and
Keep the
congrats.
passion alive.
All right, okay.
Thank you
Bye.
so much.
Talk to you soon.
Bye.